unfortunately, this administration's China hawkishness when it comes to chips is as ill-informed as the prior administration, and they are absolutely shooting themselves in the foot. Welcome to Telltales. I'm Mike Nicoletti. Every week, along with my co-hosts Jason Wallace and Hunt Lawrence, we bring you the Cash-Flow Memo. Get it at telltales.us. For the next 30 minutes, we're going to dive deep into energy, technology, and healthcare. So download the memo now and get started.
The following conversation is intended for informational purposes only. You should always do your own work to determine if an investment is suitable for you.
I'm really going to talk mostly about China today. So in going through Exhibit C, B, and A, I'm going to put a little extra emphasis on China. On Exhibit C, China oil consumption has flatlined. I think part of that is a lot more battery cars on the roads, and part of it's probably a soft economy. But part of it is, as the Chinese economy gets more mature, if you look at the bottom half of Exhibit C, developed countries like the US, Europe, Japan really don't have much in the way of oil demand growth. So it may just be a maturing of China. Nothing's really changed from last week in the supply. The talks between the US and Iran go on. Clearly, Saudi Arabia's in favor of those talks, trying to encourage both the US and Iran to get to a point where the US drops sanctions on Iran exports, including oil. So I think during this period of time, since of the 4 million barrels of extra capacity out there, 2 belongs to the Saudis, I think they will continue to curtail production and hold the price up to encourage Iran that they are better off making a deal with the United States. Exhibit B, the price of oil is down in a significant way. It'll be down further this Thursday or tomorrow. It's kind of hanging around the $60 range. The amount of backwardation, namely future prices being lower than current price, has been reduced. As far as natural gas pricing also is declining. 26 price is still holding it at $4, but remember it was as high as $4.50. The culprit here, I say every Wednesday, is dry gas production at 106. It's running 106 in April, so conceivably an average for the year could be higher. Natural gas use for power slowed down a bit, but LNG is excellent. Up 13 last year, 16 this year. So the demand side, it's okay. It's just that pesky supply side. Exhibit A, impact on China. The tariff revenue, I believe, in the top paragraph of Exhibit A is in that excise and others. And it actually has been running about $300 billion a year. And that's not much when we need $2 trillion to close the gap or $1 trillion to get the gap down. So it's 3% of GNP, but it is something. And presumably that number will get somewhat higher, but it's not really going to significant. I mean, we do $3 trillion of imports, 10% on $3 trillion is $300 billion. It won't be 10% across the board, but the exceptions and whatnot. So I can see that number building up by 200 or something, but that doesn't close the gap in a significant way. I believe that the budget for fiscal 26, which starts next October, needs to come down to $5.5 trillion, down from $6 trillion. In other words, the spending away from interest. I think it just has to. And since Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid are a pretty significant chunk of that $6 trillion, there needs to be some savings there. In the all other category, there needs to be some savings. You got to find $500 billion. And without that, I think there's a risk of Treasury auctions being very sloppy. And I think what we've seen is with Trump, so we're going to talk tariffs, with Trump, The only thing that impacts him on his quest to put in tariffs is the possibility of a failed Treasury auction. When it looked like that was happening, we went from reciprocal tariffs to 10% across the board while we negotiated. And I think that impact will continue. What we want to do, we want to try to go through all 20 pages of companies and go through the impact in the event that China and the U.S. decouple. In other words, a very high tariff, Chinese exports into the U.S. or U.S. exports into China, they continue to be at these very high rates, 140, so that Chinese goods are just not shipped to the U.S. I guess we get empty shelves, and something similar happens to China. With that, I'll stand down for a bit, see if Mike or Jason have anything to add on Exhibit A or the situation with China.
Looking at this potential situation where we actually fully decouple, it would be pretty dramatic. So I do think this exercise of going through all 20 pages and kind of just identifying how dependent we actually are in each case is a useful use case. You have two things that'll play out. One is the immediate impact, and the second is what's the long-term strategy to actually complete the decoupling, relocate manufacturing elsewhere and stuff like that. So,
yeah, I think I think what we should assume, I don't know whether we get Jason on board with this, because Mike and I talk every morning. Jason, what we're thinking is that we could go through all 20 pages of companies, assuming that China and the U.S. stay decoupled for the foreseeable future, say at least through year end, and see where who's hurt. Maybe there's some people that are helped. I just think that's at this point, that's a little more likely to happen than less likely. But what's your view, Jim?
I guess I haven't even considered a scenario where we're completely decoupled. Maybe I'm just optimistic that we'll figure it out. This will be interesting.
Why don't we start from page 20? We'll try to get through all 20 pages before our 30 minutes is up. And we'll go very quickly, and we'll miss some things probably. But on page 20, obviously this is not good for Five Below. They specialize in goods for teenage girls or preteen girls, and this is going to be a difficult patch for them. I don't see most pharmaceuticals being impacted, including Arrow. It seems to me they can, one way or the other, get the raw materials they need somehow. Uber, DoorDash, and Airbnb, I mean, some impact for sure, because but not significant. Can you comment on that analysis of page 20?
I'd say on Airbnb, the impact of Chinese travel on their destinations is actually pretty substantial. So, does it mean that people from China aren't going to travel to other parts of the world? Probably not, but they are fairly dependent on that as a growing consumer base, really, an affluent class that is traveling.
Yeah, I think Jason would agree. I mean, there'll be way limited overseas travel by Chinese.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the U.S. is seeing a big drawdown in just all international tourism.
Yeah.
Hard to say if it's, I'm sure some parts of it are the Trump administration, some parts there's an economic slowdown globally. So,
Page 19, United Health. I think Jason really doesn't think much of United Health, but I don't think they're impacted too much by tariffs. Lilly has all kinds of products. They probably pull some raw materials from China, but just assume, Jason, that you can kind of, even in the short term, figure out where else to access that material from. Maybe that's too optimistic.
Yeah, I think I don't think there's any real reason that I know of, I'll have to look into it, that you couldn't source the materials from other places. It's just that that was the low-cost supplier for these chemical products. So.
Now, there is some market there for both Regeneron and Lilly's products.
Oh, it's within China.
Within
yeah,
China.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that will have an impact. But
yeah, at the same time, pharmaceuticals are generally pretty high margin. So they have room to absorb some of the tariff.
Albemarle, the principal lithium company here on page 18, God knows what this means for Albemarle. They produce lithium all over. Maybe that'll be okay. And lithium is in oversupply now, so.
Right. It could actually be relatively beneficial for them. I mean, maybe they get their operation in North Carolina up and running, and if a lot of the supply is kept off the market, then it could be beneficial.
Yeah. Now, basically, all of the refinement of lithium occurs in China.
And that's not easily cited here, I don't think.
No, I know Tesla is trying to open a lithium refinement factory somewhere in Texas to be close to their Austin production.
Yeah.
I know there's cleaner ways to refine the lithium, but it's at a much greater expense than what occurs in China.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think they're building there. I think down along the Gulf Coast. FedEx and United, I would think FedEx would have to be impacted somewhat. Back and forth from China. Nike, has to be impacted, I guess. So much of their gear is made in Asia.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where, in the case of Nike, it's Vietnam, I believe, mostly, where their production occurs. So the interesting thing about Nike is they've just been slaughtered in the market by a couple of upstart brands that are all made in China. So in a way, assuming Vietnam isn't also decoupled, it could be relatively okay. Now, what do those brands do? They're just going to move their manufacturing operations elsewhere. But that may give them an opportunity to reestablish themselves.
Can't be good for Hilton. Impact on travel.
Right.
Shouldn't impact Celsius. McDonald's and Starbucks probably have a lot of operations in China.
Yes.
Right. Certainly Starbucks.
Yeah, not Chipotle, though. I don't think they have anything in China.
Yeah. Chipotle, they've got problems with guacamoles from Mexico, but I think that's managed.
The avocado cartel.
Yeah.
The next page is all pharmaceutical companies. And Jason's right. The margin's so big. I mean, it costs them to get material from somewhere else. I still think they manage okay.
Well, so there is a couple points for some of these companies, in particular Lantheus. In two ways they're impacted is, one, the rare earth. I don't think it's a complete ban, but it's a limit on the amount of exports. So rare earth metals are used in the magnets in the PET scans, MRI machines, just the imaging machines, as well as one of the rare earth elements in particular is used as part of the prostate cancer treatment. So the radioligand therapy, so the actual treatment that Novartis has in the market and that Lantheus is looking to bring to market. Mike and I were looking at it. Some of that's sourced out of Canada. So there's other sources of that. We're not sure of the impact there.
Well, Russia is the major supplier. So,
yeah.
So it's not just China, but you take some of that offline, then you could have some issues.
Yeah. So
on the issues like lithium, all that stuff is refined in China. And it's pretty environmentally challenging to do that refining.
Yeah, the radiopharmaceuticals are more done domestically and in Germany.
Yeah.
But that's a much more sensitive manufacturing process.
What about the cystic medicine for Vertex? Seems to me I remember that the raw materials there may come from China.
They do.
Yeah.
They have huge. They have the majority of their manufacturing operation is all in China. And that was an early decision when it wasn't hugely popular to bring manufacturing into China. That was early in Vertex's life. So I don't know. our view is that you could reshore that if you had to.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the margin is relatively de minimis.
Yeah. Cat has operations in China. I mean, this has to be a challenging time for someone like Caterpillar. For earnings day, they were okay, but it's not ideal. Deere, I get the sense that Deere has less China exposure than Cat does. Generac, I'm not sure has any at all. TransDigm, probably a little, but most of that. Fastenal must source stuff from China, but they're an awfully resilient company. They probably have been working away at getting their nuts and bolts and washers other places.
Yeah, actually, in their most recent earnings call, they talked about how during COVID, because of the supply chain disruptions, they had to find alternative suppliers of a lot of different stuff. So it sounds like they're pretty happy with the playbook that they have as far as the second and third tier suppliers that they've established.
The banks, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, I think they'll be fine. I mean, they do business in China, but, frankly, as you see from the first quarter results, all this Apple markets volatility, they seem to thrive on. Interactive's probably pretty much the same story. To the gas companies, there is some impact here on LNG, which is the growth market for the U.S. gas business. Not so much LNG into China, but as part of the Trump administration is having cash penalties, like lots of cash, like $1.5 million for a Chinese-made ship to call the U.S. port. And the LNG companies are complaining about it. The oil companies, the OGL, I mean, they're going to have to cope with lower oil prices, but they'll come through it pretty well. They'll just reduce their capital spending. The midstream companies, more or less, I think are pretty. I mean, some of them are serving LNG export facilities, but I mean, I think the LNG doesn't go to China, it'll go to Europe or Japan. I don't think that's going to be an issue. The large oil companies, Cheniere, of course, is all LNG. I think all these guys do well in lower oil pricing, but Oxy's just a little bit unusual because it has so much more debt relative to its cash flow. It gets us all the way to Walmart. What do you think, Mike and Jason? Just empty shelves, or?
I think that's how it's going to start. China seems intent on restricting the flow of goods, and likely doing that as an effort to increase the temperature domestically in the U.S. and maybe get some sort of agreement going. So in the short term, I think that's the impact, is empty shelves. I've read some reports saying that could happen as soon as early June, end of May.
Yeah.
Definitely port activity on the West Coast here is down. Right now is the period of time when these retailers are placing their holiday orders. So the holiday sales season could greatly be impacted, and that's where they make their profit for the year.
I don't see the credit card companies being impacted too much, maybe less travel. The phone companies and the cable companies, I think, are probably okay, kind of unimpacted. I think we've prior Wednesdays, we said Netflix has customers in China, but I think they're pretty well immune. What about Meta? Meta's not very active in China, are they?
Well, their primary activity is not, they don't have anything in China. They've been blocked out of the market.
Right.
That said, pretty much all of their revenue is generated by advertising, and the advertising is to sell products that I would guess more often than not are made in China.
Yeah.
So I think Meta is going to be an economically sensitive stock. It will always have the benefit of having a relatively global revenue base, but the U.S. is its primary source of revenue. So,
NVIDIA. I mean, let me try first. You guys know it much better, but just don't think that much of their gross margin comes from China, maybe 10 or 15%, or that understating the case.
It's a good question. Obviously, some of the final assembly happens there now. Foxconn's doing quite a bit of it. So that could be a challenge, but it also is stuff that could be sourced somewhere else. So maybe it's short-term disruption, long-term, fine. And then the question is how much of their sales are happening in China. And there's been some debates about that recently.
Yeah, the main concern was such a large portion of their sales is attributed to Singapore. So the knee-jerk reaction is that Singapore is not that big of a nation. Those sales must be going to China. Why else would you kind of hide where they're occurring? But Jensen's recently said that that's not the case. There's other reasons. If you're a server manufacturer or assembler, you might want to put your business based in Singapore. And a lot of the end product actually, from what Jensen was saying, is that end product ends up in the U.S. So the amount of sales that people initially thought that were going into China might not be as large.
What I'm thinking on page 3, and this would extend to Taiwan Semiconductor and ASML, AMD, is decoupling has a certain advantage of the Chinese because they want to be more self-reliant. And whether it's Huawei, designing chips, or Schmidt making them, a kind of a extended period of decoupling from the U.S. is going to make the Chinese companies more they're going to advance faster, I would think.
I'd say more than just, it's not just that they advance faster, it's that they may advance along a different trajectory than we do. If everybody was on NVIDIA hardware, which we were up until weeks ago, I guess we are still today, but the new Huawei chips are competitive with an H100. And with that, they'll be shifting to a different software base. So that means all those engineers in China are all going to be developing on a different software base than the engineers in the US. So the optimizations they make with their hardware and with their software will end up being different. They have different constraints than we do. They have maybe cheaper power and more abundant power. They also have less good chips. They'll have relatively inefficient chips. So maybe they'll be better at developing more efficient algorithms as they did with DeepSeek. So the fear is that we go on two separate trajectories, and it's very hard to determine at the outset if one trajectory is going to be better or the other one over the long run. So unfortunately, this administration's China hawkishness when it comes to chips is as ill-informed as the prior administration, and they are absolutely shooting themselves in the foot. And I'll just continue beating my drum on that point because it doesn't make any sense at all. Trying to restrict something that they're going to do anyways is, we better off have them using our tools for it.
Yeah, and I guess in relation to ASML on this page is we've all kind of just assumed that EUV lithography is the way you make advanced chips, and it is today. But there were other ways that you could produce lithography machines with extreme ultraviolet light. They were just a lot less economical. In particular, an ASML machine takes a tremendous amount of power, but the other ways took even more power. But what China is doing is building a nuclear reactor every other day. So if you remove the power constraint, there's other ways that they can create chips essentially with particle accelerators. They can image at these EUV levels. So these most advanced chips. I haven't heard of them doing it, but the research was all done 20 years ago on how to do this. So I can't imagine they're not going down that path of creating UV lithography using different methods.
They absolutely are. There was actually a research. Now, this was done in the lab, so it's not that, going from lab to production is a big difference. And one of the challenges with the alternative path is that it is slower also. And when we think of a fab, we want to produce, 10,000, 30,000, 100,000 wafers a month. This other process is slower, but there's probably other ways to scale it. So, I wouldn't be surprised if they're on the leading edge in, 4 or 5 years.
Now, Taiwan Semiconductor they've been moving their production to Arizona. Well, not moving. They've been adding to their capabilities in Arizona. So they have a pipeline of, I believe, 6 fabs now that they're planning to build there. They're starting to believe they can build the latest and greatest chips in Arizona. And the big thing really is they've announced that they're going to open a research center there. So they're really kind of replicating the model they have in Taiwan now in Arizona, where they'll be able to design and improve the processes there locally and produce the most cutting edge chips there. So it kind of is a big departure from TSMC in that all of that occurred in one campus in Taiwan, and now they're hedging their bets and moving some of that capability to Arizona.
Right. And they would have done that without any subsidy, I think, just from a strategic point of view.
Yeah, I think you can't ignore the Chinese threat.
Yeah. On the software page, I guess Broadcom would be impacted, but I'm not sure Salesforce, ServiceNow, Snowflake, or Oracle would be too much impacted by.
Well, Oracle does a pretty decent business in China with their databases. The clouds there, Alibaba's cloud and Baidu and whatnot, they offer those databases on those clouds. The others are all sort of like secondarily impacted due to all these data centers basically run on components that are made in China, or at least assembled.
Yeah, I guess we didn't talk about it back when the Home Depot and Lowe's page, but all the semiconductors that go into home appliances are coming from China.
Yeah. Yeah, if you haven't ordered an appliance you need replacing, you probably need to think about that. No question. I think it'll be kind of COVID kind of situation there.
Okay, let's take a quick break for a message from Oakcliff Sailing.
Hi everyone, we're down in the nav station on the JB66, which we've been working on for the past couple weeks, and tonight we're gonna leave to head to Oyster Bay. If you come on deck with me, as you see, we've got the sails loaded in. And we've got the mainsail on. We've been working on launching Wizard over there. That's going to come down this weekend. And we'll be in Oyster Bay soon.
And now, back to the show.
We're all the way to page 1. Apple seems to have an exemption to bring in electronics. I guess Jason's optimism is that maybe the press release is we have 145 tariffs, but there's so many exceptions. Effectively, it's that doesn't really keep that much out.
Well, if we decouple, Apple's in a really tight position. They're able to make the lower end iPhone models in India. What I've heard is the iPhone Max and Pro, maybe not Max, I forget which is which. The Pro models for sure I think they have to be assembled in China just from the expertise of the manufacturing there. So that's going to be a much tougher process that will take years. I mean, they're 2 years into moving to India, and they're only doing a fraction of their manufacturing there. I think I heard next year or the year after, they're hopeful that the entire U.S. supply can come from India to avoid some of these tariffs. But decoupling would be very difficult.
And you follow Jason and Mike, you get your iPhones now rather than waiting for iPhones from India.
We both have upgraded in the last few weeks. So
Amazon, it's a little bit like Walmart, empty shelves, I guess.
Empty shelves, higher pricing. when I bought the cables for our meeting room thing, like that nice USB cable was like $10, shipped, delivered same day. So you got to figure that $10 cable probably has $5 in margin in it. And it probably costs about $5 to get to your house. So that's like a zero margin transaction. So what's the, if that cost of that cable goes to from $5 to like $12.50 or $15, does it really change your purchasing that much? Maybe. I mean, certainly might be less. But if you had to reshore that production in the U.S., it would cost you a whole lot more than $15 to make the cable. So.
We've run out of time. So next Wednesday, we will start on Alphabet, Microsoft, and Tesla. Alphabet has had good results. Microsoft is announcing the results after the close today, I think. Tesla, the question for Tesla, just to set the stage for next Wednesday, is if Tesla's trading for $800 million, is $400 million a proper valuation for what they'll be able to do with robotaxis and robots? And let's save that for next week. In the meantime, everyone be well and stay healthy. For those of you not in the New York area, New York has been beating San Diego on weather for the last several days, which very rarely happens. But San Diego seems to be the best weather in the country, but New York's had bad recently. I doubt if that will continue. But we will be here seven days from now. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
The views expressed on this podcast are the host alone and do not constitute an offer to sell or a recommendation to purchase or a solicitation of an offer to buy any security nor a recommendation for any investment product or service. While certain information contained herein has been obtained from sources believed to be reliable, neither the hosts nor any of their employers or their affiliates have independently verified this information, and its accuracy and completeness cannot be guaranteed. Accordingly, no representation or warranty, expressed or implied, is made as to, and no reliance should be placed on, the fairness, accuracy, timeliness, or completeness of this information. The hosts and all employers and their affiliated persons assume no liability for this information and no obligation to update the information or analysis contained herein in the future and may or may not hold positions in the securities mentioned.